The envelope was thick, too thick for a rejection letter. I stared at it sitting on my kitchen counter, my name written in elegant script across the front, with the law firm's letterhead that made my stomach flip. Martinez Associates. The same firm that had been handling my case for 8 months. The same firm that everyone said I was wasting money on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd been home from my second job for exactly 4 minutes when I saw it slipped under my apartment door. My hands were still stained with cleaning chemicals from the office building I scrubbed every night after my day shift at the diner. 28 years old, working 70 hours a week, and still being told by every person in my life that home ownership was a fantasy for someone like me. The rejection started when I was 19. Fresh out of my mother's trailer, working my first real job at a call center, I'd walked into First National Bank with my head high and my grandmother's ring as collateral. The loan officer, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, had looked over my application with what I thought was consideration. Then he'd slid it back across his desk with a gentle shake of his head. "Miss Chen, your income is simply too low, and without established credit or a cosigner, we cannot approve a home loan. Come back in a few years when you've built up your financial profile." A few years became 5. 5 became 8. And every door I knocked on gave me the same answer, delivered with varying degrees of politeness, but always with the same underlying message. People like me don't get to own homes. People like me rent forever, move every few years when landlords sell or raise rent, and dream about stability while never actually achieving it. My mother reinforced this narrative every chance she got. "Sophia," she'd say over our monthly coffee at the diner where I worked, "you need to be realistic. Your father and I never owned anything. My parents never owned anything. We're renters. That's just who we are. Stop wasting money on credit repair and down payment savings. You could be traveling, having fun, living your life instead of chasing some impossible dream." My older brother Marcus was worse. He'd made it through college on a football scholarship, landed a corporate job, and bought his house at 25. But instead of being encouraging, he was patronizing. "Sophia, you work at a diner and clean offices. Be grateful you can afford rent somewhere decent. Home ownership requires financial stability, long-term planning, discipline. Maybe if you'd made different choices, finished college, focused on building a career instead of jumping between survival jobs, you'd be in a different position. But this is reality." The worst part was how reasonable they all sounded. Every bank officer who denied my applications, every family member who told me to lower my expectations, every friend who suggested I focus on more achievable goals. They had logic on their side, they had statistics, they had conventional wisdom that said someone with my credit history, my income level, my background simply didn't qualify for the American dream of home ownership. But something in me refused to accept that reality. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was desperation, but I couldn't let go of the vision I'd had since childhood. Walking into a house that belonged to me, hanging pictures on walls I could paint any color I wanted, planting flowers in a garden that would still be mine next year. The fantasy kept me working doubles, kept me putting 20% of every paycheck into my savings account, kept me researching first-time buyer programs and alternative lending options when everyone around me said I was wasting my time. That's when I found Rebecca Martinez. Not through any traditional channels, but through a comment thread on a financial planning forum where I'd posted my situation, hoping for advice. Someone had mentioned a lawyer who specialized in what they called creative home ownership solutions, cases where traditional lending didn't work, but other options might exist. I'd called her office expecting another rejection, another explanation of why my situation was hopeless. Instead, Rebecca had listened to my entire story during our first consultation. My grandmother's property that had been sold for back taxes when I was 16, the inheritance that should have been mine but was lost due to paperwork errors and family disputes. The wages I'd been earning under the table for years before I understood how that would affect my credit history. The medical debt from my father's cancer treatment that had somehow ended up in my name despite being a minor when it was incurred. Most lawyers would have told me to move on, accept the loss, focus on rebuilding from where I was. Rebecca saw something different. She saw a case of systemic failures, documentation errors, and legal oversights that had stolen my financial foundation before I'd even had a chance to build one. More importantly, she saw solutions. We started with the medical debt, challenging every charge, demanding proof of my authorization for treatments I couldn't legally consent to as a minor. Then we tackled the inheritance dispute, diving into probate records and property transfers that were rushed through while I was aging out of foster care and had no legal representation. Each piece of the puzzle revealed more problems, but also more opportunities for correction. For 8 months, I paid Rebecca everything I could afford while she fought battles I didn't even understand. She filed motions and challenged records and negotiated with debt collectors while I kept working my 2 jobs and saving every penny I could spare. My family thought I was delusional, throwing good money after bad, paying a lawyer to chase windmills when I should have been accepting my place in the world. My mother had been particularly harsh about it just last week. We'd been sitting in my tiny studio apartment, the one with the paper-thin walls and the landlord who raised rent every year without improving anything, when she looked around with visible distaste. "This is fine, Sophia. This is enough. You're clean, you're safe, you're not homeless. Stop trying to be something you're not. Stop paying that lawyer to give you false hope. Accept what life has given you and be grateful for it." My older brother Marcus was worse. He'd made it through college on a football scholarship, landed a corporate job, and bought his house at 25. But instead of being encouraging, he was patronizing. "Sophia, you work at a diner and clean offices. Be grateful you can afford rent somewhere decent. Home ownership requires financial stability, long-term planning, discipline. Maybe if you'd made different choices, finished college, focused on building a career instead of jumping between survival jobs, you'd be in a different position. But this is reality."
You're 28 years old, Sophia. You're too old to be chasing fairy tales. Real adults adapt to reality instead of fighting it. You want stability? Find a roommate. Split the rent. Build up your savings account. Stop playing victim and pretending some lawyer can magically fix your poor financial decisions. Their words echoed in my head as I picked up the envelope from Martinez Associates. This was it. 8 months of hope, 8 months of payments I could barely afford, 8 months of believing that maybe, just maybe, the system that had failed me could be made to work in my favor. The envelope was going to contain either vindication or the final proof that everyone else had been right all along. My hands shook as I tore it open, pulling out not just a letter, but a thick stack of documents. Legal papers with official seals, forms with signatures I didn't recognize, and on top of it all, a cover letter in Rebecca's neat handwriting. The first line made my knees buckle. "Congratulations, Sophia. We did it." I sank into my kitchen chair, scanning the words that seemed impossible even as I read them. The medical debt had been completely removed from my credit report due to improper authorization. The inheritance case had been resolved in my favor with damages and interest that created a substantial down payment fund. More than that, the property my grandmother had lost to back taxes had been improperly sold, and through a combination of legal challenges and bureaucratic errors, I now had first rights to purchase it back at the original tax debt amount. But it was the final page that made me cry. A pre-approval letter from a credit union based on my corrected credit score and the inheritance settlement, approving me for a home loan at a better interest rate than my brother had gotten 3 years ago. Rebecca had included a note explaining that she'd already contacted several real estate agents, and one had identified properties within my budget that could close within 30 days. I read every document twice, then called Rebecca's office with shaking fingers. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "Did you see the closing timeline? We can have you in your own home before Christmas if you want to move that fast." Before Christmas, 6 weeks away, after 8 years of being told it was impossible, after months of family members insisting I was delusional, after decades of believing that people like me simply don't get to own homes, I was going to have keys to a place that belonged to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family had been telling me to accept reality, I'd been working with Rebecca to change it. While they'd been insisting I lower my expectations, I'd been meeting with real estate agents and touring properties. While they'd been advising me to give up my dream, I'd been scheduling inspections and comparing mortgage rates. I hadn't told them about any of it because I knew what they'd say. I knew they'd find reasons why it wouldn't work, why I shouldn't get my hopes up, why even if the legal issues were resolved, home ownership would still be beyond my reach.
I'd learned to keep my dreams private, to pursue my goals without seeking their approval or validation. Now, sitting in my studio apartment with pre-approval papers spread across my tiny kitchen table, I realized I had a choice to make. I could call them right now, share the news, prove them wrong. Or I could wait until I was holding actual keys, until the deed was in my name, until there was no possibility of them talking me out of it or finding problems with the plan. The decision was easy. I was going to let my home ownership speak for itself. The house was perfect. Not in the way that million-dollar homes are perfect, but perfect for me. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with actual counter space, and a backyard big enough for the garden I'd been dreaming about since I was 12. The real estate agent, Sandra Kim, had shown me the listing photos over coffee 3 days after I'd called Rebecca's office, and I'd known immediately this was it. It sat on Maple Street in a neighborhood that was quietly transitioning from rundown to revitalized. The kind of area where young families were starting to move in, where small businesses were opening, where the houses had good bones, but needed owners who could see their potential. The asking price was exactly at the top of my pre-approval range, which meant my offer would need to be competitive and my financing would need to be flawless. Sandra had been skeptical when I first contacted her. I could hear it in her voice during our phone conversation, the way she'd asked twice about my pre-approval letter, the cautious way she'd suggested we start by looking at condos or smaller properties. But when I walked into her office with Rebecca's documentation and the credit union's approval letter, her entire demeanor had shifted. She'd studied the papers with the focused attention of someone who'd seen too many dreams fall apart due to inadequate financing, then looked up at me with something approaching respect. "This is legitimate," she said, almost surprised. "Your debt-to-income ratio is actually excellent, and this credit score puts you in a very strong position. We can definitely work with this. When would you like to start looking at properties?" The first house she had shown me had been wrong in every way. Too small, too expensive, in a neighborhood where I'd never feel safe walking home from my night job. The second had been closer, but needed more work than I could afford to take on. The third had been the charm. The moment I'd walked through the front door and seen the hardwood floors, the built-in bookshelves, the way afternoon light filled the living room, I'd known I was home. Sandra had watched me explore every room, noting how I'd opened every cabinet, tested every faucet, stood in each space trying to envision my furniture arranged there. When we'd finished the tour, she'd asked the question I'd been dreading. "So, what do you think? Are you ready to make an offer?" I'd been ready for 6 weeks, ready since the moment I'd read Rebecca's letter, but saying it out loud felt like jumping off a cliff. Yes, I'd told her, full asking price, standard contingencies, closing in 30 days if possible. She'd raised an eyebrow at that timeline. "Most sellers prefer 60 days for closing. Are you sure your financing can move that quickly?" My credit union had already assured me they could close in 3 weeks if all the paperwork was submitted promptly.
After 8 months of legal battles and 8 years of preparation, I wasn't interested in drawing out the process any longer than necessary. 30 days, I'd repeated. I want to be moved in before Christmas. The offer was submitted that afternoon. By evening, we had a counteroffer that accepted my price, but requested a 45-day closing period and asked me to cover half the closing costs. It was more than I'd planned to spend, but still within the range Rebecca had calculated during our budgeting session. I'd accepted immediately. That night, alone in my studio apartment, I'd called my mother to share the news. I'd expected skepticism, maybe some concern about whether I was moving too fast, but I'd hoped for at least a moment of happiness for me. Instead, I'd gotten something closer to panic. "Sophia, what have you done? You can't buy a house. You work at a diner. What happens when you lose your job? What happens when something breaks and you can't afford to fix it? What happens when you realize you can't actually afford the mortgage payments?" I'd tried to explain about Rebecca's work, about the inheritance settlement, about my improved credit score and debt-to-income ratio. I'd walked her through the numbers, showed her how my monthly mortgage payment would actually be less than what I'd been paying in rent increases over the past 3 years. But she'd interrupted me before I could finish. "This is insane, Sophia. You're setting yourself up for foreclosure and bankruptcy. You need to call that real estate agent right now and cancel this contract before you destroy your life." The conversation with Marcus had been worse. He'd listened to my explanation with the kind of patience that felt more like condescension, then delivered his verdict with the authority of someone who'd never doubted his own worthiness for home ownership. "Sophia, I'm going to be blunt, because someone needs to be. You're making a massive mistake.
Real estate isn't just about qualifying for a loan. It's about having 6 months of mortgage payments and savings for emergencies. It's about being able to afford a new roof or a broken furnace without going into debt. It's about having job security and career growth potential. You have none of those things. When I tried to tell him about the emergency fund I'd been building, the stable employment history I'd maintained, the home inspection contingency that would identify any major issues before closing, he'd waved me off. An emergency fund of what, $3,000? That's not even one major repair. And stable employment at a diner and a cleaning service isn't the same as stable employment with benefits and growth potential. You're setting yourself up to lose everything, and when it happens, don't expect the family to bail you out. His words had stung more than my mother's panic, because they'd contained just enough truth to plant seeds of doubt. I wasn't buying this house from a position of wealth or career stability. I was buying it from a position of determination and carefully managed resources, which felt much more precarious when he laid out all the things that could go wrong. But it was my sister Alina who delivered the worst blow. I'd called her last, expecting support, since she'd always been the most encouraging about my goals, the one who'd never told me to lower my expectations or accept limitations. Instead, she'd been quietly devastating. "Sophia, I love you, but I have to ask, are you sure this lawyer isn't taking advantage of you? 8 months of payments for what sounds like a miracle solution to problems that other lawyers said were unsolvable? And now suddenly you have inheritance money that's been missing for over a decade? Are you certain this is legitimate and not some kind of scam?" The question had hit me like a physical blow, because it was the one fear I'd been suppressing for months. What if Rebecca had been overpromising? What if the legal victories were less solid than they appeared? What if I was about to commit to a mortgage based on settlements that could still be challenged or overturned? I'd spent that night going through every document Rebecca had provided, verifying account numbers and settlement amounts, confirming that the money was actually in my bank account and not just promised to be there. Everything had checked out, but Elena's doubt had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. The home inspection had been scheduled for the following Tuesday. Sandra had recommended an inspector she'd worked with for years, someone thorough but reasonable who would identify real problems without killing deals over minor issues. I'd taken a personal day from the diner to be present for the inspection, wanting to understand exactly what I was buying and what challenges I might face as a new homeowner. Walking through the house with Inspector Mike Rodriguez had been educational and terrifying in equal measure. He'd found issues I'd never have thought to look for: electrical outlets that weren't properly grounded, a bathroom vent that exhausted into the attic instead of outside, a section of roofing that would need attention within the next few years. But he'd also confirmed what I'd sensed during my first visit. The house had good bones, solid foundation, and systems that were functional, even if they weren't perfect. The final report had estimated about $8,000 in recommended repairs and improvements, with roughly half being urgent and half being things I could address over time. It was more than I'd hoped, but less than I'd feared, and well within the contingency fund Rebecca had insisted I maintain specifically for post-purchase issues. I'd submitted the inspection report to Sandra with a request for the sellers to cover $3,000 of the most urgent repairs, a compromise that would leave me with manageable issues to address after closing. Within 6 hours, they'd agreed to split the difference at $1,500, bringing my total cash outlay to within $200 of my absolute maximum budget. That night, I'd called Rebecca to confirm everything was still on track from the legal side. The inheritance funds had fully cleared, the credit report corrections were permanent, and my mortgage approval was solid through closing. Unless something completely unexpected happened, I would be a homeowner in 18 days. For the first time since I'd opened that envelope from Martinez Associates, I'd allowed myself to fully believe it was really happening. I'd started researching moving companies, pricing furniture for the rooms that would finally have space for more than just a bed and a small table, planning which projects I'd tackle first once I had keys in my hand. But the doubt my family had planted kept growing. Late at night, when the excitement wore off and I was left alone with my fears, I found myself wondering if they were right, if I was taking on more than I could handle, if I was setting myself up for a failure that would prove everything they'd always said about my limitations and unrealistic expectations. The mortgage company had called that morning requesting one final piece of documentation, proof that my night job income was consistent and ongoing. It was a routine request, Sandra had assured me, but I'd spent the entire day in a state of low-level panic, terrified that this would be the detail that unraveled everything.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'd provided pay stubs from the past 6 months, a letter from my supervisor confirming my employment status and average hours, and bank records showing consistent deposits. By afternoon, they'd confirmed receipt and indicated everything looked good for closing as scheduled. Sitting in my studio apartment that evening, surrounded by boxes I'd started packing even though I still had more than 2 weeks before moving day, I realized I'd reached a point of no return. The house inspection had passed, the financing was approved, the legal issues were resolved. In 18 days, I would either be holding keys to my own home or facing the most spectacular failure of my adult life. Either way, I'd finally know whether my family had been protecting me from inevitable disappointment all these years, or whether they'd been the only thing standing between me and the life I'd always believed I deserved. The closing was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Wednesday that felt like the most important day of my life. I'd requested the day off from both jobs, something I'd never done for anything that wasn't a medical emergency, and spent the previous evening laying out my outfit like I was preparing for a job interview. Professional but not pretentious, confident but not presumptuous. I'd settled on the black dress I usually saved for funerals and holidays, paired with the one pair of heels I owned that didn't hurt my feet after standing for 8 hours. Sandra had prepared me for what to expect: a conference room full of papers to sign, representatives from the mortgage company, the title company, and the seller's agent, and about an hour of paperwork that would transfer ownership of the house from strangers to me. She'd walked me through each document I'd be signing, explained what every fee represented, and assured me that everything was standard and expected. But nothing could have prepared me for the emotional weight of that morning. Walking into the title company's office, seeing my name printed on official documents, watching strangers treat this monumental moment in my life as routine business. The sellers were an elderly couple who'd lived in the house for 37 years, and they'd insisted on attending the closing to meet me personally. Mrs. Patterson had gripped my hands with surprising strength when Sandra introduced us. "We're so happy it's going to someone who'll love it the way we did," she'd said, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "Harold built those bookshelves in the living room himself, and I planted every flower in that back garden. Take good care of our memories." The signing process had been exactly as tedious as Sandra had warned, but I'd read every single page, initialed every line, and asked questions about anything I didn't understand completely. The title company representative had seemed impressed with my attention to detail, commenting that most first-time buyers just signed wherever they were told without reviewing the actual terms. When we'd reached the final document, the deed that would officially transfer ownership to me, my hand had actually trembled as I signed my name. Sophia Chen, printed in black ink on a legal document that meant I now owned 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a backyard where I could plant anything I wanted. After 28 years of temporary addresses and landlords who could end my housing security with 30 days' notice, I had a permanent address that belonged to me. The moment the title representative had handed me the keys, Mrs. Patterson had started crying openly. Harold had cleared his throat and shaken my hand with the formal dignity of a man passing on something precious to someone he trusted to preserve it. Sandra had congratulated me with genuine warmth, mentioning that in 15 years of real estate, she'd never worked with a buyer who'd been more prepared and determined. I'd driven to the house immediately, parked in the driveway that was now mine, and sat in my car for 10 minutes, just staring at the front door. My front door. My windows, my roof, my responsibility and my sanctuary, and my proof that everyone who'd said this was impossible had been wrong. Walking through the house with my own keys had felt like entering a different universe. Every room looked bigger somehow, more full of potential now that I could make decisions about paint colors and furniture placement without asking anyone's permission. I'd stood in the kitchen planning where I'd put a small table for meals that weren't eaten standing over the sink or sitting on my bed. I'd measured the living room windows for curtains that would actually fit properly instead of whatever the previous tenant had left hanging. But it was the backyard that had undone me completely.
Standing on the back porch, looking out at the garden space that Mrs. Patterson had tended for nearly 40 decades, I'd finally allowed myself to cry. Not the frustrated tears I'd shed after conversations with my family, not the overwhelmed tears from stressful moments during the buying process, but tears of pure joy and relief and vindication. I'd called Rebecca first, wanting to thank the person who'd made all of this possible. She'd answered on the first ring, and I could hear her smiling when I told her I was standing in my own kitchen. "You did this, Sophia," she'd said firmly. "I just cleared away the obstacles that were keeping you from what you'd already earned. You worked for this house for 8 years. You saved for it, you qualified for it, you deserved it. Don't let anyone tell you this was luck or charity or anything other than the result of your own determination." Then I'd taken a deep breath and called my mother. I'd practiced what I wanted to say during the drive from the title company, but standing in my own living room had given me a confidence I'd never felt before. When she'd answered with her usual tone of worried disapproval, I'd cut straight to the point. "I'm calling from my house, Mom. My house. I closed this morning and I'm standing in my living room right now. I own this place." The silence had lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she started talking rapid-fire questions about whether I was sure the paperwork was legitimate, whether I understood what I'd committed to, whether I'd considered what would happen when I couldn't make the payments. Instead of defending my decisions or explaining the financial details again, I simply said, "You can come see it this weekend if you want. Sunday afternoon. I'll give you the address." Marcus had been harder to reach, but when he'd finally returned my call that evening, his response was predictably skeptical. "You actually went through with it, Sophia. I hope you know what you're doing, because when this falls apart, you're going to lose everything you've worked for. Don't come crying to me when you're facing foreclosure in 6 months." I'd hung up without responding, something I'd never done before in my life. Standing in my kitchen, unpacking the groceries I'd bought to stock my own refrigerator for the first time, I realized I didn't owe him or anyone else my gratitude for their doubt. I didn't need to prove myself or justify my choices or convince them that I was capable of managing my own life. Elena had surprised me by showing up unannounced the next day with a housewarming gift, a small potted plant and a card that apologized for questioning my lawyer's legitimacy. "I was wrong to plant doubt when you were already nervous. I should have trusted your judgment and supported your dream. The house is beautiful, and you deserve every happiness it brings." Walking through the rooms with Elena, explaining my plans for each space, sharing my excitement about finally having room for the hobbies I'd never had space to pursue, I'd felt something shift between us.
She'd stopped treating me like the little sister who needed protection from her own poor decisions and started relating to me like an adult who'd accomplished something impressive. The first month in the house had been a whirlwind of small projects and major adjustments. Learning how to maintain systems I'd never been responsible for, figuring out which neighbors were friendly and which ones kept to themselves, establishing routines in a space that was large enough for actual routines. But every challenge had felt manageable because it was mine to solve. Every improvement had felt worthwhile because I'd be there to enjoy the results. I joined the neighborhood association, something I'd never been able to do as a renter in places where I knew I'd be moving within a year or two. I'd started planning a vegetable garden for spring, researching which plants would thrive in my soil and climate zone. I'd hosted Elena and her kids for dinner, cooking in a kitchen with enough counter space to actually prepare a real meal. Most importantly, I'd stopped checking my phone every time my mother or Marcus called. I'd stopped seeking their approval or validation for decisions that were mine to make. I'd built a life that didn't require their permission or understanding, and their ongoing skepticism had become irrelevant to my daily happiness. 3 months after closing, Marcus had called with news that his own real estate investments weren't performing as well as he'd expected. Property values in his neighborhood had stagnated, his rental property had vacancy issues, and his mortgage payments were becoming stressful on his corporate salary. Meanwhile, my neighborhood had been featured in a local magazine as an up-and-coming area where young professionals were finding affordable homes with good investment potential.
I'd listen to his complaints with genuine sympathy, but without the desperate need for his approval that had characterized our previous conversations. When he'd made a comment about hoping I was managing my mortgage payments responsibly, I'd simply said, "Everything's going well, Marcus. Thanks for asking." My mother had never visited the house despite multiple invitations. She'd continued to predict disaster, to question my financial decisions, to suggest that I was in over my head and should consider selling before the inevitable crisis hit. But her predictions had lost their power to shake my confidence because they were contradicted by my daily reality. Every month that I made my mortgage payment on time, every small repair I completed successfully, every improvement I made to increase the value and comfort of my home proved that her fears were unfounded. I wasn't drowning in homeownership. I was thriving in it. I wasn't struggling with responsibilities I couldn't handle. I was learning and growing and building something permanent. Standing in my backyard on a Sunday morning, 6 months after closing, drinking coffee from my own kitchen and planning which flowers to plant where Mrs. Patterson's garden had been, I'd realized something profound. The house hadn't just given me ownership of property, it had given me ownership of my own narrative. I was no longer the daughter who needed protection from her unrealistic dreams, the sister who made impractical decisions, the young woman whose goals exceeded her capabilities. I was a homeowner. I was someone who'd identified what she wanted, worked systematically to achieve it, and succeeded despite everyone's predictions of failure. I was someone who trusted her own judgment over her family's doubts and been proven right by results that spoke louder than their concerns ever could. The house was mine, but more than that, my life was finally mine too. 2 years later, I was hosting Thanksgiving dinner for the first time in my life. Not because anyone had asked me to, but because I'd wanted to and finally had the space to make it happen. My dining room table, a solid oak piece I'd found at an estate sale and refinished myself, could seat 8 people comfortably. My kitchen had enough counter space to prepare a full meal without feeling cramped. Most importantly, I had a home that felt worthy of celebration, a place I was proud to share with the people I cared about. The guest list had been carefully curated. Elena and her 2 children, Rebecca and her husband, Sandra Kim, who'd become a genuine friend over the past year, and my neighbors Tom and Linda, who'd welcomed me to the block with homemade cookies and offers of help with yard work. I'd also invited my mother and Marcus, though I'd made it clear that attendance was optional and criticism of my life choices was not welcome at my table. Preparing for that dinner had been one of the most satisfying experiences of my adult life. Shopping for ingredients without worrying about whether I'd have enough money left for rent, cooking in a kitchen that belonged to me, setting a table that would still be mine tomorrow and next week and next year. Every step had felt like a small victory over the voice in my head that still sometimes whispered my family's old refrains about knowing your place and accepting limitations. The morning of Thanksgiving, I'd been pulling my first turkey out of the oven when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see my mother standing on my porch with a covered dish, looking nervous in a way I'd rarely seen before. She'd driven the 40 minutes from her apartment, something she'd done exactly twice since I'd moved in, and only after repeated invitations. When I'd opened the door, she'd thrust the casserole dish toward me with an awkward smile. "Green bean casserole," she said. "Your grandmother's recipe. I thought maybe you'd want to serve it today." The gesture had been so unexpected, so different from her usual anxiety about my home ownership choices, that I'd actually gotten emotional accepting the dish. The afternoon had unfolded better than I dared to hope. My mother had complimented the house repeatedly, noting improvements I'd made since her last visit, asking about my plans for the spring garden, and even admitting that the neighborhood seemed safer and more welcoming than she'd expected. She'd watched me move confidently through my own kitchen, orchestrating multiple dishes and timing everything perfectly, and I'd seen something shift in her expression. Marcus had arrived late, as usual, but without his typical air of condescension.
He'd brought wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget and had actually seemed impressed by the renovation work I'd completed in the guest bathroom. When Rebecca's kids had asked if they could explore the backyard, I'd noticed him watching through the kitchen window as they ran around the space I'd transformed from Mrs. Patterson's formal flower beds into a more casual area, perfect for children to play. During dinner, the conversation had turned to real estate, as it often did when homeowners gathered around a table. Tom had mentioned that 3 houses on our block had sold in the past month, all for significantly more than the asking prices due to increased demand in our neighborhood. Linda had added that the young couple who'd bought the house 2 doors down had paid nearly $30,000 more than I'd paid for mine just 18 months earlier. Sandra, who'd been tracking the market trends professionally, had looked directly at me when she shared the most surprising news. Sophia, based on the recent comparables and the improvements you've made to your house has appreciated approximately $55,000 since you bought it. If you wanted to sell today, you'd walk away with enough profit to buy something significantly larger or to keep this place and invest in rental property. The silence that had followed had been profound. My mother had stared at Sandra as if she'd spoken a foreign language. Marcus had set down his wine glass with the careful precision of someone trying to not reveal shock. Elena had grinned openly, clearly delighted by this vindication of my choices. But it was Rebecca who delivered the observation that made the moment perfect. You know what this means, Sophia? It means you didn't just succeed at buying a house, you succeeded at building wealth. You're not just a homeowner now, you're an investor whose instincts were better than most people with business degrees and financial advisors. After dinner, while I was cleaning up in the kitchen, my mother had approached me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of pride, regret, and something that looked almost like awe.
Sophia, she'd said quietly, I owe you an apology. Not just for doubting your house purchase, but for doubting you. I spent so many years trying to protect you from disappointment that I never stopped to consider whether my expectations were too small, not whether yours were too big. The conversation that had followed had been the most honest we'd ever shared. She'd talked about her own fears, the way her parents had raised her to believe that people like them didn't get to have ambitions beyond survival. She'd admitted that seeing me succeed at something she'd been told was impossible had forced her to question everything she'd accepted about limitations and possibilities. Most importantly, she'd acknowledged that her constant warnings hadn't been protection, they'd been projections of her own fears onto my life. Marcus had been slower to come around, but even he'd seemed subdued by the reality of my success. When Elena's kids had begged him to see the upstairs bedrooms, he'd followed them on a tour that had ended with genuine compliments about the way I'd decorated and organized the space. Standing in my master bedroom, looking out the window at the backyard where I'd built raised garden beds and installed solar lighting, he'd finally admitted that maybe I'd known what I was doing all along. The most meaningful conversation of the day had happened after everyone else had left. Elena had stayed to help with dishes, and we'd found ourselves talking about dreams and expectations, and the difference between being realistic and being self-limiting. She'd confessed that watching me pursue homeownership had inspired her to reconsider some of her own goals that she'd abandoned as impractical. I've been telling myself for years that I can't go back to school because I'm too old, because I have kids to support, because people like me don't get master's degrees, she'd said while drying my good china. But if you can buy a house working at a diner and cleaning offices, maybe I can figure out how to balance graduate school with single motherhood. Maybe we've been setting our own ceilings instead of reaching for what we actually want. That conversation had continued long into the evening, 2 sisters finally talking honestly about ambition and possibility instead of focusing on all the reasons dreams don't come true. By the time Elena had left, we'd made plans for her to research programs, for me to help her create a study schedule that would work around her parenting responsibilities,
for both of us to stop accepting other people's definitions of what was realistic for our lives. The following spring had brought changes that validated everything I'd believed about investing in my future. The Neighborhood Improvement Association had secured funding for new sidewalks and street lighting. A popular coffee shop had opened 3 blocks away, followed by a small bookstore and a restaurant that specialized in locally sourced ingredients. Property values had continued to climb, but more importantly, the area had become the kind of place I genuinely loved living. I'd used my equity to refinance at a lower interest rate, reducing my monthly payment by nearly $200. That extra money had gone toward home improvements that increased both my comfort and my property value. Updated appliances, hardwood floor refinishing, a small deck off the back door that made my morning coffee routine even more enjoyable. But the real transformation had been in my relationship with work and money and planning for the future. Owning a home had given me a different perspective on financial stability, one that focused on building assets rather than just covering expenses. I'd started a retirement account for the first time, opened a separate savings account for future home improvements, and begun researching investment opportunities that could supplement my income. Most surprisingly, I'd been approached by 3 different real estate investors who'd heard about my success story through Sandra. They'd wanted to partner with me on fix and flip projects, recognizing that my combination of hands-on skills, financial discipline, and market instincts could be valuable in identifying undervalued properties. I'd decline their offers for now, preferring to focus on my own home and stability, but knowing the opportunities existed had changed how I thought about my potential. The second anniversary of my closing date had arrived on a Wednesday, just like the original. I'd taken the morning off work, not because I had to be anywhere, but because I'd wanted to mark the occasion privately. I'd walked through my house, room by room, noting everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same, thinking about the woman who'd signed those papers 2 years earlier and how different her life had looked then. That afternoon, I'd been working in my garden when a car had pulled into my driveway. Sandra Kim had gotten out with a bottle of champagne and a folder of documents, grinning like she had news she could barely contain. "I brought you something," she'd said, settling into one of the lawn chairs I'd arranged under the maple tree that had convinced me to buy this particular house. The folder had contained recent sales data for my neighborhood, market analysis reports, and a comparative market assessment for my property. According to Sandra's research, my house was now worth nearly $90,000 more than I'd paid for it. More than that, the improvements I'd made had contributed significantly to that appreciation, proving that my instincts about which projects would add value had been remarkably accurate. But the final document in the folder that had made me actually gasp out loud was a pre-approval letter from my credit union, based on my current income, assets, and credit score, approving me for a second mortgage that would allow me to purchase an investment property. The loan amount was larger than I'd ever imagined being approved for, based on wealth I'd built through a decision everyone had insisted was a mistake. "You could buy another house," Sandra explained, her excitement obvious. "Rent it out for passive income while it appreciates, then use that equity to buy a third property. You've already proven that you have the skills and judgment to succeed at real estate investment. Why not turn it into a business?" Sitting in my backyard that evening, champagne glass in hand, looking at my garden where tomatoes and herbs were thriving in the raised garden beds I'd built with my own hands, I thought about trajectory and possibility and the difference between accepting limitations and creating opportunities. 2 years earlier, my family had been convinced I was setting myself up for failure. Now I was being invited to expand into business ventures that could provide financial independence. The irony wasn't lost on me. The house I'd bought as proof that I was capable of achieving stability had become the foundation for ambitions I'd never dared to consider before. The investment my family had seen as reckless had turned into the smartest financial decision of my adult life.
The dream they'd dismissed as unrealistic had become the launching pad for dreams even bigger than homeownership. I called Rebecca that night to share Sandra's proposal and get her thoughts on the legal and financial implications of real estate investment. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Do it," she said without hesitation. "You've already proven you can succeed at this. Now prove to yourself how big that success can become." As I hung up the phone and settled into bed in my own master bedroom, looking out the window at the neighborhood I'd helped improve through my presence and investment, I realized something profound. I'd spent so many years trying to prove to my family that I was capable of achieving what they considered impossible. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their validation and started exceeding even my own expectations. The house had been just the beginning. It had been proof of concept, evidence that I could trust my own judgment and work systematically toward goals that seemed beyond my reach. But it had also been preparation for opportunities I'd never imagined, foundation for building the kind of life that didn't just meet my needs, but created possibilities for growth and expansion I was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow, I'd call Sandra back and start exploring what it would take to become a real estate investor. Tonight, I'd fall asleep in my own home, surrounded by proof that sometimes the people who tell you something is impossible are just revealing the limits of their own imagination, not the boundaries of what you can actually achieve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.